There we are. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for the launch event for Ron Nyren's debut novel, The Book of Lost Light. My name is Evan Karp. I'm the events manager for Booksmith. We're an independent bookstore, legacy business, and mainstay of San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district since 1976. Launching new books with local authors is one of our favorite things to do, even more so for debuts. As many of you know, each book has its own story, most of which are long and involve small armies of people. I think we're in for a special treat tonight, as we'll hear not just from Ron, but also from the members of his writing group of nearly 20 years, in itself, in my opinion, an exceptional achievement. Here to celebrate with Ron are Ann Packer, Angela Newman, Ann Cummins, Lisa Michaels, Cornelia Nixon, Sarah Stone, Rafael Yglesias, and Vendela Vida. A huge thank you to all of you for joining us tonight. And to Ron, huge congratulations to you on Pub Day. We're honored to host your launch event, and I'm very happy to turn it over to you now.
Okay, thank you so much, Evan, for that beautiful introduction. And I just want to say heartfelt thanks to the Booksmith and the Bindery for hosting this event and so many amazing events. And just to thank everyone for coming. And I also want to thank my brilliant writers group for all your help along the way and for being here tonight to help with the celebration. And thanks to my editor, Diane Gettle, and Black Lawrence Press for believing in the book and bringing it into the world, and to Zoe Norvell for designing this beautiful cover and the interior. And particular thank you to my friends and family who've been here all along. And a big shout out to my spouse, Sarah, for giving me so much encouragement and love and wisdom and insight as I wrote and rewrote this thing. And I'm just really, really happy to be here with you all. So just to give you a quick idea of the structure of the evening, I'm going to start by reading a short passage. Then I'm going to ask everyone in the writing group a question. Then I'll read another short passage. Then the group will have a Q&A, and then we'll open up to questions from the audience. So start thinking of those or type them in at any time. So I started writing this novel with a simple question. What if you grew up being photographed every day of your life? And at first I thought it would be set in contemporary times, and the photographer might be someone like Sally Mann, who famously photographed her children as they grew up. But then I thought of Edward Muybridge, the man who pioneered the photography of motion, and the idea started going in a more scientific direction, and then it veered into the historic and came to be set in the San Francisco and the East Bay. So there are three main characters: Arthur, the photographer, who becomes obsessed with capturing time the way Muybridge captured motion; Joseph, his son, and the subject of his project; and Cornelia, Joseph's older cousin, who helps raise him and becomes a photographer in her own right. So I'm just going to read a passage from early in the book. The year is 1891. It's San Francisco. And all you need to know is that Joseph's mother died giving birth to him, and his father, Arthur, has taken to his bed. A Hungarian flat family in the flat above, the Hodgdews, looked after my father. Two of the Hodgdew daughters had recently given birth, and they wet nursed me. In the evenings, Mrs. Hodgdew brought my father chicken, potato soup, pork goulias, and cabbage noodle dishes. He ate little. One morning in early September, a knock came on the door. At first, so hesitant, he thought it was only footsteps on the stairs. Too heavy with grief to rise, he dozed off. A loud pounding awoke him. He climbed out of bed, opened the door, and was nearly hit by a shoe. A skinny girl in canvas overalls and a heavy coat stood in the hall, her pale hair blown about. In one hand, the shoe with which she had been banging. In the other hand, an envelope with his name on it. He took it, mystified, and scanned the letter inside. We offer our deepest condolences. We are sending you your niece, Cornelia. She is very capable and knows how to look after infants. She is not happy at home, and we believe she will be of great help to you during this difficult time. Quickly, she slipped inside and set down the sack she carried, as if to establish a claim. Her gaze quickly fixed on something behind him, the loaf of bread the Hajjus had left the night before. "I'll cut you a slice if you wash your hands," he said. When she did not move, he clarified, "You'll have to wash your hands first." They looked filthy. Also, she stank. He led her to the sink and turned it on for her. He wondered if she'd seen running water before. She spent nearly 5 minutes scrubbing her fingers. He buttered a slice of bread and watched her devour it. He cut her another slice, gave her a drink of water, and reread the letter. "Did anyone travel with you?" he asked. Having eaten the second slice of bread, she sat unmoving at the kitchen table. "Can you speak?" said my father. "Yes." "How old are you?" She gripped the table. 15. He judged her to be no more than 12 or 13. "I'm sorry," he said. "I wasn't expecting anyone. They might at least have sent the letter beforehand. How this scrawny, untalking girl could be of any use was beyond him. Are you tired?" She gave him a glazed, imploring look. He rose, stripped the sheets from his bed, which hadn't been washed in weeks, and remade it clumsily with fresh ones. She crawled on top of it fully clothed and fell asleep. That was my father's version of the story of Cornelia's arrival. Cornelia told me she wouldn't have knocked with a shoe. "My knuckles were harder than shoes," she told me, "from working on the farm. He didn't offer me anything to eat or drink until I asked him. He looked half dead, unwashed, with big circles under his eyes. If anything, he was less talkative than I was. The idea that I was mute when I arrived must be his invention." My father and Cornelia often remembered things differently, or perhaps it's more accurate to say that they told different stories. For example, Cornelia had never met my mother, but sometimes, when I was very young, I found this difficult to understand. And I would ask her what my mother had been like. Cornelia would say, "Your mother was a tall and elegant woman who always wore pearls, even when she was cooking dinner." Or, "She loved to play the violin so much, she would stay up all night practicing." Once, she told a long story about my mother trying to buy a violin that she recognized as a Stradivarius in a junk shop. Unfortunately, she could not conceal her excitement, and the proprietor, realizing it must be very valuable, kept raising the price. When I repeated Cornelia's tales to my father, he would sigh. "None of that is true," he would say. "She never played the violin." "You photographed her playing it," I said. The violin belonged to a friend of hers. I don't know why Cornelia makes up these stories. Cornelia would have been 18 or 19 then, beautiful, restless, and increasingly given to wild inventions. I could never resist encouraging her. The photographs of my mother proved too tempting a source of inspiration. "Tell me about the time my mother scared off an outlaw with her sword," I would ask, and Cornelia would oblige. So because this book relies so much on research and because it's such a part of every writer's life, I thought I'd ask the group, what's one fun or surprising thing you learned in researching one of your novels? I'm going to ask Sarah to go first. Sarah?
Thank you. So I was thinking about this question of research because even when we're doing something that's close to our own lives, let alone when we're not, we wind up having to go and find out more. And for Hunger Games Theater, there was a fair amount of library and internet research, but I also did a lot of stuff, immersion in one way or another. There were a lot of actors and playwriting. So I took playwriting, I took acting, I took improv, I did theater of the oppressed class. And one of my favorite improv games is what I'm remembering is dolphin training. And what it is a group of people in the improv can get someone to do almost anything by giving them little dings of approval when they're on the right track and then going totally silent when they're not. So I've seen, like in my class, there was somebody who was able to they were brought into the room. They were able to go around, go up the stairs, get a drink of water, come down, open a newspaper. You know, I had in the story somebody singing, telling folk tales, and it was just remarkable to me how much you could do with the simple withdrawal of attention. Like, and this just strikes me, I don't know why this strikes me right now, but when you totally withdraw your attention from something, all of the air goes out of it. And so people would stand there and there was complete silence, and then they would not do it, but then they would start any action, and there was like this ding, ding, ding of approval. And yeah, that's my piece of research that I wanted to share. So let's see, we all have different screens. I'm looking down and I see Vendela. Vendela, do you want to go next?
Hi, thanks for sharing that, Sarah. I was wondering if the same thing applies to writing groups, if people just stay quiet and don't say anything, if the writer takes that as a sign that something's not working. My favorite, you know, I've learned so much from every book that I researched, and I learned so much from talking with all of you about researching. And but my most recent thing that I discovered when I was writing my last book, it comes out in February, We Run the Tides, was set in San Francisco, and I was researching homes in San Francisco, and I was researching this magician's home in San Francisco I used to always pass when I was younger, and I never really knew who lived there. I assumed that Houdini had lived there because I knew a famous magician had lived there. And when I was researching, I found out that Carter the Great had lived there. And then it set me on this path of really trying to figure out what the inside of this house had looked like. You know, what does a magician's house look like? And mind you, this was only one sentence in a book, but this is what writers do, right? You can find this one sentence and you have to get to the bottom of it, and it can take you 2 days of research, as I'm sure Ron experienced, you know, as well when writing his book, and all of you have experienced. But I found out that inside of Carter the Great's house in San Francisco, he had a theater in his basement, as you know, so he could entertain, but he also had a dining room table that rose up through trapdoors. And I just love that idea that you would just have trapdoors, and every evening would kind of a magical event with something surprising coming up literally through the floorboards. So that was my fun research. And I will pick the next person. Below me, I see Lisa Michaels. Hey, Lisa.
Hi, thank you for, you know, passing the baton. I was trying to think about this. So there were lots of little things researching both this historical novel that I wrote about a pair of newlyweds who tried to raft down the Grand Canyon. There were little nuggets that were super important to me, but I thought the most important thing I learned was probably that saying I'm working on a novel is like a magic sentence that makes people share what they know. So I had a guy who I knew was raised on a ranch and shot this kind of a rifle, and I wanted to know what would be a thing to say that he was a really good shot. And I called just literally the gun shop in the Yellow Pages, because it was like pre-internet, and said, hey, I'm working on a novel and I want to know what a guy in the 1920s with this rifle who was a good shot. And he said, just right away willing to drop everything and really get into your problem with you. So he said, yeah, you know, at this yards, the bullet drops so far that you have to aim for the head to hit the heart. So at this distance, it would be like a deer would look like a mouse, and you're aiming for the head to hit the heart of the mouse, you know? And I was like, okay, thank you. So I was just struck more than anything by when you're on this little passion project hunt, like Vendela, you want to find something out, that people are very generous, and that people who even aren't working on books might just, when they have a question, try calling someone and saying, hey, I'm working on a book. Do you mind telling me what you know about, you know, X, Y, or Z little cranny of the world? And then I think all of us maybe share that love of the archives, of going in and you put on your white gloves and they bring you this piece of paper that no one's probably asked to look at in a really long time. And I used to get little shivers about that. Like, this was real pen, real ink, written by somebody going around the Cape Horn in 1849. And no one has asked for this in a really long time. And now I'm reading it. What you do with it, that's a whole nother matter. So I will pass the baton to Ann Cummins.
All right, this is such a fun question. Thank you for thinking of it. I went back to my novel Yellow Cake for my most fun. I mean, fun is the key word here. I'm doing a lot of research that's not fun right now, but fun is directed me to a character in Yellow Cake, my character Sam. And basically in my fiction, I find that characters always draw me into the research. So I need to know and feel and inhabit my characters before I know, what's important to them and where they're going and, basically what their lives are. My character Sam wanted to get far away from where the novel is set, which was in New Mexico. So he went to Florida and he became he learned how to tie flies for his living there. He lived down in Marathon. I'd never been to Marathon, Florida, and I loved Google Maps. So I got to get a street map of Marathon. I learned where the fish and tackle stores were there. And I learned an amazing amount about how to tie flies for fishing. I just want to read some names of the flies that Sam learned to tie. They were called the blue dun, the black gnat, the coral moth, the mirth, the red-winged moth, the silver speeder. He learned how to fish for mackerel with little white flies that skim across the top of the water. And I loved that. And I felt so much that I knew it, that I could go do big fish or deep sea fishing with the flies that Sam tied. But what was interesting to me about this question is I hadn't read that in a long time. I had to go search for it. And I had forgotten all of those names. I once knew those names so well that I could, I memorized them. And I was interested in how it tied in with a theme of Ron's book, which is what time takes away from us. And I find when I'm living in a novel, I know it so well. And then really, my fiction has slipped away from me. And it's lovely to go back and remember, but it's completely different than when you're living the character. So that's me. I will call on Angela Newman.
Hi, it's so great to hear all these examples of good research. I'm going to give you my worst and my best. My best is happening now, and I have never understood why people are fascinated with like true crime and serial killers. And I'm writing a crime novel, and so my guilty pleasure is watching all these shows like Forensic Files and all these things you can get now, wherever you want to find them. And I'm loving every minute of it, this gruesome information and how Forensic Files is changing all the time. Like now they've completely thrown out blood spatter evidence, where for a long time they, convicted people on blood spatter evidence. So I'm having a lot of fun, and it feels like work, but it's really, just probably a terrible thing to spend my time on, but it's helping, and I still don't, because the novel is still mostly unwritten. I can almost justify anything that I want to watch instead of, pushing forward with pages. So that's the best. The worst is when I was doing my MFA, I wanted to write a story about the Mary Kay makeup selling company. And so I called them and I said, can I come to this conference? And it was a one-day conference held at the hotel in Bloomington, Indiana. And the woman on the phone was very friendly. She said, yeah, come. And are you interested in joining Mary Kay? And I was very clear that I wasn't, that I was writing a story. So she told the organizers of the event, and there were maybe 200, there were lots of people there. She told them that I was writing a story, but either I wasn't clear with her or she wasn't clear with them that it was a fiction story. So I arrived and they thought I was a journalist, and they were not friendly. I mean, like I kept trying and I kept asking questions, and they wanted to know why I wanted to know everything. So I left. I didn't finish the story, but I left feeling very suspicious of Mary Kay as an organization. And it's one of those, I mean, I think it's legitimate, but it's one of those sort of pyramid type things where you have to get people below you to sell and buy. And they were very sort of defensive about questions, and it could have been the manner I asked them. But I ended up, staying there for a very uncomfortable 3 hours and then leaving and feeling a little iffy about the whole experience. So, but it was funny at the same time. And they did a lot of them wore pink suits, and there were several of the pink Cadillacs in the parking lot, and they were true believers for sure. So that's for me. I think the last folks are Rafa and Anne, right?
And Cornelia too.
Yeah.
But we'll go, and then we'll
pass it to
call
Cornelia.
on Neil. But first, Angela, we have to know, what effect on the story did that experience have? Like, did it tinge the way you portrayed the character who was involved in Mary Kay?
I finished a draft of the story and I ended up not going back to it. It didn't fit in the way I thought it would, but I have thought about revisiting the phenomenon of the company again and calling it, like Mary Stay or whatever, something very close, but not exactly. So I didn't, it wasn't what I need. It didn't end up being what I needed. So it didn't really affect it that much, except that it didn't go anywhere.
Right. That's an effect. Do you want to go first, or shall I?
Sure, I'll go first.
Okay.
Mine didn't start as research, and it didn't exactly end up as research. When my first son was born in 1981, I rented a small office in a building of small offices, and I worked there for 37 years. In fact, I stopped working there when they tore the building down. So I guess partially out of grief over losing this place, I decided I should write a novel about it. And while I had been there during those 37 years, because this building was a hotel in the 19th century and didn't become an office building till the early part of the 20th, I'd heard from people, a number of what famous folks had been there. I heard that Mark Twain had worked with Ulysses Grant on his memoirs. I heard that Mary Lincoln and the former enslaved Elizabeth Keckley had gone there to try to sell her dresses. And I knew from tenants in the building when I arrived that there were a number of other left-wing and what I thought of as lost causes. The Abraham Lincoln Brigade had its offices there. There were many other union organizations. The IRA, the Irish Republican Army, had an office there. And I came to think of it as the building of lost causes. And I sort of thought of what I was doing as kind of a lost cause as well. So I decided I'd write a novel called The Building of Lost Causes, and I began to seriously research in the last year or two what was actually in the building. And I found out some of it was nonsense. Mark Twain and Ulysses Grant were never there. The Mary Lincoln story was true, and of course, the Abraham Lincoln Brigade had its offices there and so on. But I decided I wanted my novel to be about a Cuban American who had been brought here in the 60s. My father comes from a Cuban American family, but they came much earlier in the 19th century. And what I decided I wanted to do is write a time travel novel in which he keeps getting sucked back into the past of the building where he's working and discovers all these little hidden parts of the lost causes of American history. And I became regretful that I couldn't bring him in any way to the history of Cuban Americans in the United States, that Jose Marti, for example, was in New York for 10 years in the 1890s, and various other things. And it frustrated me, as often my research does, that it just doesn't give me exactly the perfect story. So I gave up on that and decided I would just invent whatever I wanted to invent. And then recently, reading a piece about how popular conspiracy theories had become, the article went back and showed how back in the 60s and 70s, there were also a fondness among left-wingers for conspiracy theories. And they started harping on all the conspiracy theories about JFK. And they said, one of them were the many conspiracies and theories about whether Lee Harvey Oswald was an assassin for the CIA or an assassin for the Cubans and so on. And what a big scandal it was when it was brought out that he had passed out leaflets, Lee Harvey Oswald, before he did the assassination in New Orleans for a left-wing organization called the Fair Play for Cuba, Committee, which was a pro-Fidel committee in the early 1960s. And they had a picture of Lee Harvey Oswald's membership card in the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. And on the membership card, on the website, was the address of my old office building. The scandal of him having been arrested for the assassination broke the committee, and they left the building. And apparently it was so shameful that nobody in the building ever remembered it. It was a lost part of history. So by accident, the research worked out.
It's funny. From one building to another. So my novel in progress, or maybe out of progress, recently possibly completed, is a novel that I really struggled with. Probably if I looked at it right now, I would feel the struggle flooding back. And a lot of the struggle was, well, what the hell is this about? I had disparate storylines, different time periods. And at one point, and when I write, I write very instinctively. I can't plan for the life of me. In real life, I'm a total control freak, plan to the last minute, but with writing, I just go. And at one point, while I was writing this novel, I had a man in the 1930s who was a psychoanalyst. And I was telling his story by having journal entries that he wrote. And I would love to resurrect this moment, but for whatever reason, I looked up, where might he have taken an 8-year-old in Manhattan? And I stumbled upon a thing called the Museum of Non-Objective Painting. And I love the name of the museum. It's just so absurd. And so I put that in, and that was where he took his son. And it turns out that it's a real turning point for the characters, because this man was, as I said, a psychoanalyst and a psychiatrist, and he calls his answering service and finds out that he's had a patient attempt to take his own life. And so he decides that it's appropriate that he leave his son alone in the museum, give the museum guy money to get his son into a taxi, and he leaves and goes off to the hospital. And so it's one of those sort of moments in a family's history, like the time you left me in a museum, it just becomes super important. And many years and frustrations into writing this book, I suddenly realized that that was my title. My book was going to be the Museum of Non-Objective Painting. So I had already investigated what it was, and I knew that it was where the growing Guggenheim collection was housed before the Frank Lloyd Wright building on Fifth Avenue in New York. A small place in a former car dealership on Madison Avenue, which is in and of itself really hard to picture. But just in the last year or so, I finally got a book that had photographs of the inside of the Museum of Non-Objective Painting. And I neglected to mention that the little boy, despite being abandoned, had been very taken with the art there, which was all non-objective and geometric. And he was a science kid and really liked it. And I was delighted and amazed when I actually saw photographs of the interior of this museum to discover that the art was hung at floor level. So rather than up high on the wall, everything was along the baseboards. And I actually am going to try to show you a picture, which may be foolhardy, but we'll see if it works. It's the weirdest display of art that I can imagine. So bear with me. I don't know if that Does that work at all?
Yeah.
So anyway, that was the Museum of Non-Objective Painting. And it made perfect sense that a little boy would be really taken with art hanging at his own level. So that's my little story. And I think we go to Neil now.
Cornelia Nixon, hi. Thank you. And you cannot abandon the Museum of Non-Objective Painting. Sorry. I think we all loved it when you showed it to us this summer. You must continue. I apologize to everyone for being late in arriving. I was trying, but I had only registered as an audience member, it turns out, not realizing we had a special link. And finally, Sarah and Evan were able to help me get on here, so I apologize. I've been thinking about, I love research. I'm good at it, and it's something I've been trained to do. And I can get lost in the research. It's so wonderful. I have two major candidates for my favorite moment of research, and I'll give you one, and if you want the other one, I'll tell you that one too. I'm going to pick the moment in my novel, Angels Go Naked, which is a novel in stories. When you're first introduced to Webster Hale, who calls himself Unutchimakichigamik, which means he lives beside the sea in Algonquian. He's living in Bolinas and doing research for a PhD in microbiology, oceanic microbiology at UC Berkeley. He's collecting samples out there in Bolinas and testing them. He's specifically interested in the larval stages of the moon jellyfish. And I found wonderful stuff. I was teaching at Indiana University at the time, and I would spend a lot of time. Hi, Angela. Yes, I have to say, that's an aside. Angela, I read that Mary Kay story. I was Angela's thesis director at Indiana. You should go back to that story, okay? Meanwhile, while reading Angela's thesis, I was down in the bowels of the biology library at Indiana University, reading about everything I could find about the moon jellyfish. And I discovered that it goes through an amazing cycle of 4 phases. I think it's 4, I don't quite remember the details, in which it doesn't look like a jellyfish at all until the end. At one point, it looks like a tiny palm tree. At another, it looks more like a floating starfish. It's completely wonderful. And I discovered, reading the recent research, that the slight rise in ocean temperature in the last few decades has caused the moon jellyfish to stall out at a pre-adult phase, not reaching sexual maturity. And this became an obsession for my character, Webster, Unutchimakichigamik.
Cool, thank you, Neil. Wow, this is just a great panoply of fascinating stories, and I want to hear more. And if you want to hear more, you go out and get all their books if you don't have them already, because these stories are in there. So I'm going to read another little passage, and then we'll go to some Q&A. So this one comes from the middle of the book, after the 1906 earthquake has sent the family fleeing to Berkeley to stay with Arthur's patron, Mr. Hallgarten. And all you need to know is that Thomasine is Mr. Hallgarten's daughter. And by now, Joseph is about 14 years old. Tuesday night after dinner, Thomasine invited me to sit on the balcony with her to watch the stars come out. It was 6 days since the quake. We stared at the city across the bay as its blackened ruins slowly disappeared in the twilight. It seemed to me she and I were bound to each other in some way. There were several imbalances between us: her father's greater wealth, our presence on their property, our dependence on their help. Yet it struck me that she was aware she still owed me something in the ledger of intimacy. I wanted her to know that she could trust me. I leaned closer to her as if to get a better look at the city, but it was her profile that I studied. How had I not seen before how beautiful she was? Do you ever wonder, she said, then stopped. I was trying to formulate some kind of compliment about her eyelashes when a noise came from the yard below. We stood. A figure approached the house, moving uncertainly, tracking back and forth as if correcting course. A man I didn't recognize. Right before he was about to go out of sight beneath us, he stopped, swayed, and fell. "Mama," Thomasine cried, bolting into the living room. I followed her down the stairs and out the door. She leaned over the man lying with his face in the grass and turned him over. His eyes were closed. He wore a long greatcoat with a singed hole in the front, large enough to put a hand through. His hat had fallen off, revealing a considerable mass of long black hair. Mud caked his shoes and trousers, and the reek of earth and whiskey came off him. Thomasine ran into the house. I thought to get her mother, but instead she returned carrying a vase of flowers. She yanked out the bouquet and upended the water over his face. I admired her quick thinking. He sputtered and gave a shout, half rising on one elbow. A flower stem, blackened and flattened by rot, clung to his stubbled cheek. He wiped his face and looked around, groggy. After a moment, he extended his fingers toward Thomasine. She set the vase down, as if she thought he wanted her help getting up, but instead he grasped the flowers by their heads. She let go, and their stems reluctantly released from her palm. "You need to get that hand looked after, darling," he said. She held up her palm in the moonlight. Beads of blood appeared where thorns had dug in. "I didn't notice they were roses," she said. Mrs. Hallgarten came out and sent Thomasine back into the house, eyeing the vase as if the man had been caught thieving. I explained what had happened, irritated to have my moment with Thomasine broken. "You smell of whiskey," Mrs. Hallgarten told the man. He struggled up. "My name is Nicholas Forrester," he said, "and the whiskey is, in this case, more medicinal than diversionary." He lifted his hands in the air, showing us they were scraped and swollen. Under Mrs. Hallgarten's scrutiny, he seemed to sober up. He said that he'd crossed to Berkeley on Friday and spent a damp night in the university baseball field, jammed in a small tent with 5 Scotsmen. He'd come across the newspaper's list of refugees staying in Berkeley and saw his friends, the Vissers and the Crowleys, were at the Hallgartens. Before he could leave, soldiers commandeered him to help dig latrines for the camp. 3 hours later, they let him go, and the Scots shared some of their whiskey. "I'm sorry to have collapsed of exhaustion on your lawn," he said, "and I'm grateful to the girl for the dash of fetid water to the face." So I'll stop there. Just wanted to say that sending my characters to the East Bay after the earthquake was inspired by some reason when I was researching artists of the time period, and discovered that a group of artists, including one, Xavier Martinez, who had lost their studios in the fires in San Francisco, traveled over to Berkeley and camped out in the backyard of a mutual friend, Herman Whitaker, a novelist of the time. And they lived in his backyard for many months. And Xavier Martinez would end up marrying Mr. Herman Whitaker's 17-year-old daughter within a year. So I was just fascinated by what conversations must have gone on, what revelry as they sat around the bonfire, and that inspired the writing of my novel. So at this point, I think we're at 6:15. So I think I would like to open it up to questions. If the writing group has questions, or we can also open it up to the audience questions to ask of any of us. And but I'll let Evan be the master of ceremonies for this part.
Awesome. Thank you, Ron, and thank you all. This has been so lovely. What a fun event this has been. I want to encourage you all, if you have questions, to go ahead and ask them in the chat, and I'll be happy to pass them on. We do have a question here from Joseph, and it's for Anne. He's wondering why the museum hung its art at floor level. He notes that he's a former lifelong New Yorker and never heard of the place.
I think it was the person who brought all the art together and got this museum going was a woman named Hilla Rebay, who was the lover of an abstract painter from Germany, whose name I'm now not recalling, but she was a real force and a real eccentric. And I suspect that that's why she hung the art at floor level. Something, I mean, it's a great question, and I'll have to go back to the book I have and look for it. But it was a real surprise seeing that photo.
I have a question for Ron, if that's okay.
Of course.
Ron, sorry. Thank you so much for writing this book. I just love the way it feels. It's such a beautiful book, and it's been so fun to see the revisions you've done over the years. And you've really taught me a lot about revising too. I learned so much about revision. We learned something from everybody in the writing group. And I could say what everything is. I was thinking about this today. I was thinking what everyone's taught me, but I've learned a lot about revision from you. And I'm just wondering, I know you talked a little bit about your research, Ron, in writing this book, but I'm wondering if you could mention or talk about which novels, either current or of that time period you're writing about, really influenced you during writing the Book of Lost Light?
Sure. Well, that's a great question. Yeah, when I first started to write this novel, I thought, I have no idea how to do plot, so I need to find a writer who doesn't need plot, and study how she did it. So I took down this novel that I'd only recently read a year prior, Marilyn Robinson's Housekeeping. And I thought, what a beautiful novel. There's no plot here, so I'm going to learn how she did it. So I reread it. And damn if she didn't have a plot. I mean, the language is so beautiful, the ideas are so beautiful, the characters are so wonderful that I didn't notice the first time through what a totally classic plot that book has. So that's one that I reread many times. Also, Rebecca West's marvelous novel, semi-autobiographical novel, The Fountain Overflows, British novel, but of this era. And Dickens' Great Expectations also, just for some reason, I turned to that for help in sort of navigating an older first-person narrator describing his childhood. So those three books are kind of what I call them my mentor novels, because I relied on them a lot.
Well, great. Thank you. That's so funny. Yeah, when I think about Housekeeping too, I don't think about a plot, but now I'll go back and read it and look for the plot.
I was having the same reaction. I have a question also, but I was thinking I couldn't tell you what the plot of Housekeeping is either, and I love that book. I've read it twice at least, and I have no idea what the plot is.
I can tell you what the plot is.
What?
I can tell you what the plot is. I heard the great poet Robert Hass on the subject when he was interviewing her on the UC Berkeley campus. He said it inverts the 18th century plot of trying to rise to the house, rise in station till you have the great house. And it goes the other way. You leave the house, you get away from the house, you go out back into nature, and it all frees you. That's a plot.
That is a plot.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, that's helpful. I was just struck, Ron, when you talked about Arthur's attempts as a photographer to capture time, and thinking about how, as novelists and people who work with narrative, we're always trying to capture time and manage time and maybe, deny time, or, somehow create something that exists because of time and yet always outside of time, because it can always be picked up again. I mean, the relationship to time as a writer, or even as a visual artist or as a photographer, is so it's so elusive and obvious and complicated and straightforward. I mean, it's all of these things, and I just wondered, thinking about that, and from how Arthur is trying to sort of exhibit the passage of time through motion with his experience. Did you think about like writing differently? I mean, you worked on this novel for a long time, so there's that kind of time too, like just the process of writing and living while you write. I'm just curious if you thought about time and fiction.
Yeah, Yeah, totally. And it's sort of weird. This novel took me about 15 readers to write, so it's about as long as Arthur's project lasted, which I had no idea at the outset that that was going to be the case, but there is a weird parallelism there. But yeah, I quickly, when I first started writing the novel, I wrote 3 versions of an opening in different voices and different points of view. And one of them was Joseph telling about events that happened before he was born, talking about Edward Muybridge. And that one just seemed to have the most energy and life to it. There's something about his voice. And, you know, not starting with his own story, but with the underpinnings before that, decades before he was born. So that was sort of that. Once that took place, I was like, okay, this is going to be a linear novel. This is going to, you know, go from 1870s with Muybridge all the way up to, well, I didn't know exactly when, but after the earthquake. So once I had that, I sort of didn't, you know, there could have been a variety of inventive structures that I could have pursued if I hadn't sort of had that strong sense that he was going to be a linear storyteller.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you for the question, and thank you, Ron. I have some audience questions coming in. Thank you all for asking there. The first one is from Peg Alfred Purcell, and actually also Susan Carr. We have a couple of folks who want to know what kept you immersed in this creative work over the time period that you've been working on it.
Sometimes, you know, I was baffled about what I was going to do next in the novel. I would just reach a point where I would have no idea how to proceed, but it never stopped fascinating me. I mean, I guess that's why I kept going, was I was always really interested to find out what these characters were going to do. And sometimes they kept me on tenterhooks for far too long. And I think the other thing was just because I did a whole lot of research before I started writing. You know, I had the earthquake that I was excited about getting to. I had the post-earthquake being refugees on someone's property, with all that entails, that I was excited to get to. And I had no idea what was going to happen with this project. So I really wanted to find that out. So, and there were just all these interesting byways to explore in terms of art and theater, and I was so excited to do this. It just took me a while to wrangle it all into one story and winnow away everything that, you know, like that old joke about how do you make a sculpture? You whittle away everything that doesn't look like David. There was a lot of whittling eventually, but I was just always so fascinated by all this material that I turned up that in my characters. That sort of kept me going even when I felt I was beating my head against the wall.
Thank you, Ron, and thank you, Peg, and Susan. The next question actually follows off on that. It's from Harriet Chessman, who's wondering what surprised you the most, or maybe diverted the course of your story as you wrote.
Wow, that's a great question. I was surprised. Early on, I decided to write a sketch of the plot, although I was still learning about plot. And I had an idea for the ending. And then by the time I got there, I sort of had various facsimiles of that I wound up in, but it took me a while to come across the ending. And at one point, the last version that I showed the group, I'd done tons of rewriting. I was very excited about it. And I showed it to the group and they said, wow, this is wonderful. We love what you've done. We love how you've rewritten this book. And your climactic moment, it comes about because of the actions of the minor characters. And isn't it more typical for the major characters to have a role? And I said, oh, right. So it seemed so obvious once they said it. So then I had to go back and figure out what my main characters were doing. I often have a tendency to evade and keep my main characters out of trouble by having minor characters do the trouble for them. So that was an aha moment that changed the course and led me toward my current ending.
I love that. Thank you, Ron. Also, thank you, Harriet, for the question. The next one comes from Kenneth Nyren. Perhaps you are familiar with this person. They're wondering, would you please talk about the title that you chose?
Thank you, Ken. Ken is my brother. So glad you could be here, and that's a wonderful question. I went through a lot of titles with this. It was originally, what was it originally? Boy Made of Light for a long time, and then it was Collector of Lost Light. Then I had an agent for a while, and she said, "Oh, Collector of, that's overdone." Oh no, I submitted it to her as the country, in the country of time. I kind of like that title. She said, "No, that's not good." So we went through a lot of titles. She wanted to call it Lost Light. Wasn't really crazy about that. And after we parted ways, I went back to the title that seemed the closest to what I wanted, which is The Book of Lost Light, because there is an actual book that gets involved in the plot. But it just seemed to capture the emotional tone that I wanted to set with this novel.
Love it. Thank you, Ron. And I love where you landed. I like the title a lot. Thank you, Ken, for asking. The next question comes from Melina Watrous, who is wondering, and I don't know, perhaps this is a loaded question on this evening, but what's next for you, Ron? Are you currently working on a new novel? Is it, are you working on stories? What's going on?
Yeah, thank you, Melina. Currently, I have brewing in my head, and I have written a bunch of material for a novel that's based on one of the Greek myths that the characters in this book, as they perform stories from the Finnish Kalevala, but they also occasionally do a Greek myth for variety. And so on one of those stories, just something about it captivated me. So I'm using this Greek myth as a basis for this thing that I'm working on now. So we'll see where that goes.
Awesome. I look forward to seeing that. So we have a question now from Steve Saunders. This is for any or all of the writers. Anyone who cares to respond, I'll let you chime in. The question is as follows. Do you have anything that repeatedly serves as a seed or genesis for a novel? Is there often a particular character or a relationship or a set of relationships or a phenomenon or experience like aging or falling out of love? Or likely enough, I guess, is every story different in its genesis? And if anyone would like to speak to that, I will.
Yeah, fascinating. Does anyone have an initial thought on that?
It's almost always true that no matter what the details of my stories are, that they have to do with the impact of some past trauma as it's exposed in the present. Sometimes I write that as a thriller, sometimes I write that as a comedy, sometimes as a drama, but if you look at it carefully enough, that's usually what's there.
I was gonna say, I don't know if this relates to what Rafa just said, but the seed always feels different to me, but the outcome feels remarkably related to the other outcomes. So, and usually it's coming to terms with, you know, somewhere I used to be, and a place I used to be, a certain community and culture. So, but I never think that's what I'm setting out to do. It just sort of bubbles up and shows itself to me again, you know, even if the stories are different or the book is different.
So I'll jump in here. This is on a different subject. Ron, I'm curious about the nature of performance in your book. And, you know, you've got the middle of the novel has players that come together after the earthquake to do spontaneous plays in their refugee camp. You've got Joseph, who becomes an actor, and whose endearing, wonderful character is his ability to mimic the gait of people he loves and people that he then inhabits on the stage. Can you talk about the sort of the platform of performance that holds up your novel?
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, I was in a few plays in elementary school and took some improv classes in my 20s. And so I've always been fascinated by acting, but have never pursued it in any sense. But Joseph is sort of my, my theatrical avatar. If I were a more theatrical person, perhaps I'd be Joseph. So just thinking about Joseph in front of the camera from day one, what happens to you if you grow up with that? It seems like you're not the natural part of your life is being photographed once every day. I started asking myself, well, how would you grow up? What would you expect? What would you be tended? And it just seemed to make sense that he would become an actor even before he became a professional actor. That he would have that in him and have that expectation of an audience, or be sort of trained to think of an audience. So that's kind of how that got in there. And then once I found out that some of the Berkeley residents performed plays, amateur plays in the backyards regularly, that just seemed like, okay, this is a custom of the time. This makes a lot of sense, and they would be doing this. So that sort of took over and became a plot element.
I had a question for Ron. It was so fun to dip into the book again and just remember that it's so visually precise and beautifully described, which for a book about photography is obviously a great plus. And I was thinking about some of the imagery around the earthquake and the streets where the sidewalks broken like toffee, and all these people have moved all their sofas and sewing machines into the park. And it's just very immersive and visually detailed. And I wondered, is there much of a photographic record? I mean, I know there's some of the aftermath, but like those images of the building where the front's sheared away and it's like a diorama box and people are in there trying to grab their stuff. Where did you get those images? And tell me a little bit about the research of that part of the book.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for that question, because that was a really amazing part of the research. So yeah, some of it is photographs. The San Francisco Public Library has archives. There are various online resources where you can look at photographs that were taken in the aftermath. So that helped, but also there's this great research that the UC Berkeley Bancroft Library has put online its earthquake resources collection, which includes more photographs, yes, but also tons of letters and journal entries, other kinds of documents related to the earthquake. Because everyone goes through the earthquake, then the refugees, they're writing their families. They're describing what happened to them. They're saying we're okay, and some of them are just marvelous writers who had just beautiful turns of phrases that I coveted and didn't want to steal, so I had to, but it kind of forced me to try to describe what they were describing in as vivid a detail as they were. So that was just a huge resource, and it's still online. If you Google Bancroft Library earthquake archive or your earthquake resource, you'll probably get it. And I could just spend hours reading these letters describing what people went through, the different things people went through, from the tragic to the mundane to the hilarious. That was just a treasure.
I love that. Thank you. And I know we're a little bit past time, so I have one more question. I just wanted to make sure that was okay. Ron, do we have time for another one? Yeah, and this one is kind of pertaining to everyone. It's about the writers group, and it's hold on just a moment here. This is from Howard, who sends congratulations to you, Ron, and wants to know if any of you can speak to writers groups how to start and sustain one. What's the secret specifically to your longevity? This is quite a long while for it to be meeting. What have been the greatest challenges, and how have you guys done it?
Thank you so much, Howard, for that question. That's a perfect one to end on. And I can let other people jump into, the biggest challenge is geographic dispersal, but thanks to the Zoom, we have been able to meet on Zoom because, after 20 years, people move to different parts of the country, some of us, so we're not as close. So technology has helped with that challenge. As for the longevity, I just think, finding writers we all respect and are fascinated by. It's just I'm always fascinated to see what each person comes up with, and that keeps me going. And plus, they give me brilliant advice. So I don't know. Other people have thoughts on that.
I would add into that several of us first sort of got connected at a writers' conference that we were at. People were, teaching or fellows, but I feel like there's a lot of great writers' conferences out there. The Poets and Writers has a list of them, and figuring out, does this sound like, a place where there's the people who you would enjoy their teaching, and then the people who are similar to you get drawn to that, or there's something geographical if you want to be in the same place, and it feels like a great place to go. And then over time you sort of say, hey, would you like to share, and deepen the connections. And that was a really big thing for us.
One thing I think that makes us, we love each other, but I think our flexibility in terms of our own schedules, like someone might have a draft that they want readers for, and maybe not all members of the group can read at that time. So a few members will get together and read that draft, and the people who can't participate will sign up for the next draft. So we get this kind of tiered response going on that allows us to both honor our own time and also be there for the group.
I would add one of the reasons we've been able to continue for so long and really encourage each other, I think, really lies in our desire to help each other do the thing that we want to do, each of us. So there's no sense of anybody ever being pulled or pushed in a different direction from the one that they have, clearly sort of set out for themselves. There's just a ton of respect for each person's process, vision, desires, and kind of worldview, really. So I think that's part of the secret.
I would add, just going back to Ron, that when I think about our group and I think about him, what I can visualize are these beautiful handwritten page or two long notes that he would write when you had a draft, and just the love and energy that you have put into all of us, Ron, is just humbling. You are just so genuinely for the work and just such an intuitive reader. And to the person out there who's saying, how do I find people and who am I looking for, is like, I think there's a ethic in the group of like trying to say to people, this is what it sounded like to me. And then you get to decide, okay, that wasn't what I was thinking at all. So back to the drawing board. But it's not so much about praise or criticism, but rather trying to describe how the work came across. And so he does that so beautifully. And I remember when I had a really botched book, there were several, and I was asking Ron and Sarah something, and I said, so Sarah, what do you think about this really histrionic opening scene? And she said, Ron? And I thought, oh no, like she's passing it off to the most tactful, most gentle member of the group who can do the hatchet job. So thank you for all your gifts of reading and time to all of us. It's such a genuine pleasure to see this beautiful book come to light, because the care that was put into it was also given back to us as, you're, being read by you. So super happy.
Thank you so much. Oh my God. Well, I'm just really so happy to be in this writing group, and so have been so nourished and inspired and challenged by all of you. And I just love how different everyone's writing aesthetics are, and ways of telling stories. I mean, just there's no homogeneity in this group, and yet we are able to read each other's very different works, and sort of, yeah, as people were saying, help them in their own aesthetic, or in light of their own aesthetic, see what new possibilities there are in that direction. I just feel like that's really precious to have in a writing group, is a group that, however diverse their aesthetics are, they want to see each person go further in their own aesthetic, and appreciate that aesthetic.
Well, I think that's a wonderful place to end, and what a special thing that you guys all have going on. Congratulations, Ron, for the book, and for those of you who are tuned in who don't have a copy, you should get one from Booksmith. It'll be signed by Ron, and we'll send it right to you. Yes, this is what the book looks like, and you could have your very own copy. The link is just below the video. I'll also post it in the chat here again. But thank you all so much for being here. This is really a lovely way to spend the evening, and I thank you all for it. Congratulations again to Ron. Take care, everyone. And
Sure. Thank you so much, Evan. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care.
Good night, y'all.